So let me just get started. There are 5 parts. Let's see how far we get into this. But the first one is critical towards a flat ontology. Now, it's my argument that there are 2 major threads that run through architectural history and discourse, regardless of the age, and I tend to concentrate on these in my practice. The first one is part-to-whole theories, which, strangely enough, many architects talk about briefly, sentence or 2, and whatever they write. But there is maybe there's no theory of the envelope, but maybe there's also really no theory, ultimate theory of part-to-whole relations. Every architect has a kind of mini theory embedded within their language, usually, starting with, of course, Alberti, people like that, philosophers, all through the ages. More recent people, too, speaking about that kind of stuff, Greg Lynn, Pier Vittorio Aureli, and, of course, a lot of, I guess, maybe for architecture, very, very importantly, a lot of philosophers, Leibniz, Deleuze. And I don't want to go into all of that. Suffice to say that I come into it personally from the phenomena of emergence, which is, frankly, something that comes from complexity theory in biology, but is really, I think, more important and potent as a philosophical approach to understanding the world. And so I'm very much interested in that, and it's been a thread through my work since the beginning. And more recently, in the last, I would say, 3 years, an interest in object-oriented philosophy, which I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, which I'm sure you're aware of, is becoming more and more of a discourse, let's say, of the 2010s, as much as, let's say, 1,000 Plateaus was in the 90s. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And I guess the second thing is the ontological status of architecture, meaning what exists in architecture. Is architecture constituted by building objects only? Is it constituted by relations of buildings to the city? Is it an idea? Is it a representation of architecture? What exists? What's real in architecture? So those 2 things I think are quite important. Those are 2 things that object-oriented philosophy takes on directly. And I guess for me, having gone to school in the 90s, this was especially this image on the left was a really important image. This came, although it's from Conrad Waddington, who's a genetic researcher, I came to know it through Sanford Quinter, who, of course, shows it in his essay, Landscapes of Change, which was from the early 90s. And that image was drawn to try to make people understand the loose but also contingent relationship of expression of DNA in creatures, let's say, and the underlying DNA itself, which is sort of puppeteering the expression. So imagine that this species is the ball and it's rolling down the surface, but then underneath there's this puppetry web of intensive forces that are pulling on this thing or creating a certain set of pathways for that ball to roll in. So it's indeterminate, but what is very important here is there's a huge focus on what's underneath the sheet, okay? On sets of relations or bundles of relations. So if we're to talk about the object here for a minute, and maybe we're not even to the architectural object yet, but the object as an idea, what I mean by objects is just about anything in the room, including a chair or a person or this bottle of water. If we're going to talk about the object, this theory basically says the object is an expression or a contingent effect of hidden, latent, intensive forces. So another way to think about the object is as something that's fully formed. It exceeds its relations. When you look at the jaguar and the African steppe, you don't try to understand the jaguar only in terms of its relations to its context or its environment. Or the SR-71, I think one of the most interesting pieces of industrial design from human civilization. You don't try to just understand that in terms of political or technological or engineering sets of contingencies, but you do, in fact, I think, understand it in terms of its unique and specific character and its sort of elusiveness. So, from the object-oriented philosopher, or he calls himself an object-oriented ontologist, Graham Harman, he basically says being comes in chunks, meaning it's not a field condition, it's not a flow, it's basically that's the thing and that thing exists, and we can understand it as such. So The orca. I love this guy because the longer I look at it, the more I realize I don't have full access to this object, and I think that's one of the qualities of what one might term a real object, or even an evocative object. You could, if you were a biologist, you could try to understand this thing in terms of its strange scale effects of having sort of a fake eye, which isn't really its eye, or even the high contrast of black and white relating to where the sun is, where the bottom of the ocean is. In terms of its aerodynamic skin, you could look at it that way, or you could try to understand it in terms of the effect that it's having right now as an object. It's something that you can't quite grasp. Something for me that's toy-like. It could be plastic, it could be small, it could be big, but whatever it is, it's not just. I don't think that we can understand it as just as a result or of its context. I went in there and tried to Photoshop out the water. Actually, that was a nightmare. I'm terrible at Photoshop. So the water had to stay. So what are we talking about here in terms of part to whole? Basically, on the left is a more known, I don't really want to say conventional, but a more known way of talking about part to whole, that we understand that there's a whole, and that is constituted by parts. So you have little parts in a whole. Whereas, if you talk about objects and object-oriented philosophy, suddenly you're dealing with all parts or all wholes. And so your diagram looks different. You have objects within an object. And that seems to be a kind of a it seems to be very problematic because how can something be both a whole object and also be a component of another object? How can that be? That's not the way that we're taught to think about part-to-whole relations. But that's what I'm voting for here. And the more you think about it, the more it makes a kind of almost cosmic kind of sense for what we do. So again, when objects enter into relations, we get a new object. They don't get lost and turned into a lump and disappear in favor of the new object. They retain their identity, and so does the new object. So I love this from 2001, A Space Odyssey, where Dave is up there flying over the monolith, and he goes, "My God, it's full of stars." Graham Harman himself talks about the universe as made of objects, wrapped in objects, wrapped in objects, wrapped in objects, into infinite deferral of things wrapped in other things. Which comes to something I've been working on in our discipline, which may not look like necessarily disciplinary terms. They're terms for me. The SAC is one, supercomponents are another. The SAC is basically the idea of a new object, which can also contain other objects, which again are not just subdivisions of the SAC or atoms, or in other words, the SAC can't be reduced down to its parts, but there are whole objects within the SAC. Tristan Garcia is a really interesting, super young philosopher in France right now. Still, a lot of the best philosophy still comes out of France, surprisingly. He's an amazing object-oriented philosopher, and he actually speaks about the SAC, which I found funny because I've been working on the SAC for a couple of years. But he talks about it as a SAC as being a kind of conceptual model, almost a membrane within which things can be collected, and that in fact the only thing that is not a SAC is the world. It can't be. The world cannot be. I'm going to actually just read it. There's an infinite regress of things, inside of things, except the world, which everything is inside of, and therefore itself cannot be inside something else. So the world is a non-object. The world is a non-object. Now, and this will make more sense as we go. Supercomponent. So the idea of a supercomponent, what does that mean? Usually component means it's downstream from the whole. A supercomponent, a component is usually the idea of a part. Like, let's say, a camshaft inside of an engine, that would be a component of an engine. I like the word supercomponent because it kind of implies a conundrum. How can something both be a component, which is down here, and be super, which is up here? So it expresses to me the idea that something can both be a container and a contained, or a part and a whole thing at the same time. So what's the status of this? This is the triple bird, I call it. Literally, it just appeared one day in one of my studios a couple of years ago. I can't stop looking at it. assume they're related, but who really knows? Maybe they're just friends. But you can't deny, looking at this thing, you can't deny that while they're three whole objects, that they do, in fact, sort of begin to produce a new object which exceeds the three other objects. Okay, so because every architect has to have a 5-point plan, I have 5 points for you today. I actually have 4. I forced the 5th. So 4 is the flat ontology of architecture. Now, basically, let me just define what a flat ontology is, so we're all on the same page. It means an ontology, as I said before, and as you know, is a study of, or the belief in what exists or what is real in the world. Okay? So a flat ontology would be the opposite of a flat or horizontal ontology. Would be the opposite of a vertical ontology, where you believe that things go from, let's say, the universe to the solar system to the planet to the microscopic speck on the planet's surface, or you believe in basically in hierarchies of things, and you may even believe that human beings are above other types of beings, or even other types of objects. Whereas flat ontology infers that there is a kind of democracy of things in the universe, that everything exists equally but differently, which is a quote from Levi Bryant, who's another OOO theorist, very interesting guy. So the flat ontology of architecture, and I'll just go through the 5 points, but the most important thing about this idea is that it engages this horizontal plane, and it tries to avoid old models of part-to-whole relations in the design of buildings, which hopefully you'll see in the projects in a minute. But let me go through these. So, number 1, discrete objects over continuums. And I like to think of that in architectural terms, terminals versus conduits. So we all know about those buildings that are made out of fields or out of vectors or out of mapping of movement of people through sites. And you see a lot of buildings out there, surprisingly, that end up reifying that or making that real, those things which are virtual or intensive forces. And so you get buildings, again, that you're familiar with that begin to look like flow maps, flow charts, moving of people, tubes, conduits, whatever you want to call them. I prefer terminals. The idea of a terminal is a dead end. It's something that's a singularity on the planet, and it's not just something that in a kind of maniacal way is always moving goods or services or ideas or texts or human beings through itself. Number 2, flattening vertical formal orders. I was just talking about that a second ago, but I'll be more specific. So if we think about massing, building mass, ground, interiors of buildings, and articulation of building mass, I would like to think of those as equal but different. So not assuming that the mass has priority over the treatment of the ground, or not assuming that the treatment of the massing is more important or put over the treatment of ornament. So we'll get to that more in a second. I have a drawing of that. Concentrating on mystery, not semiotics. So concentrating on the internal residence of the object, and not in terms of language or signs, or them being a sign of anything, or particularly meaning something. So getting rid of that whole debate. Number 4, context is a construct and not an essence. Ground objects versus world. So I'm going to talk in a second about what I mean by a ground object. But the point here is that I'm interested in avoiding a lot of the baggage that comes along with words like context, site specificity, all of those kinds of things, which I do not think are real. And number 5, subdivisions are false. Tattoos versus panels. So I'll take that all the way down the line into the construction and tectonics of envelopes, and how the flat ontology of architecture relates to those issues. So again, just to make that even clearer, what I just said. So a lot of architecture deals with mass, interior, articulation, ground in that order. And so I'm talking about the horizontal flat ontology of things when they can all be treated differently but equally. Another way to look at it, possibly, is like, let's say this is a ground plan on the top, where one might, if one were thinking in terms of subdivisions versus supercomponents, one might draw a plan like that, where you have an envelope, a container, and the contained is just a subdivision of that container. Whereas on the right, you have the model of an object in an object, where there are no subdivisions, it's a whole object inside of a whole object. Or below that, if you're thinking about subdivisions, or thinking in terms of subdivisions, you might think that the left, dealing with meshes and panels, is the way to go. And there's a whole, of course, discourse on that, anything to do with parametrics, panelization, variable gradient panelization, all of those kinds of things on the left. On the right, tattoos, that would be an object on an object. So a tattoo is an objectification of what we tend to call ornament. I'm gonna actually argue for the idea that a tattoo is a better word for a flat ontology. It's a better word than ornament is. I think ornament's a confusing term. So imagine an object literally being squished into or embedded into another object as a way of thinking about articulation of mass, rather than just something that's all over the mass all the time. Now, I just need to say a second you're going to see a bunch of these today. These are what I call models. A model for the office is it's something that appears at the beginning of a project through studies. It can be something that we pull out of a project at the end. It can be literally the project itself. I just want to say that this is what drives the work, but it also archives the work, and it allows us to talk about all the projects or the kind of body of work that's coming together over time, just by sort of looking at this thing. It's like a butterfly collection a little bit. So it's not a series of diagrams, and that's the main point that I want to make. These are not reductive diagrams. They imply a certain type of morphology, and a lot of them imply a certain type of building organization. So this isn't just a bunch of form. It's also not just an organizational diagram. It's a little bit of both. So, and I have a huge collection. This is about probably 3% of all of these guys that we have, these models. So, now, ground objects. Axel, how am I doing? Time. Okay. Ground objects. So, I was doing a project recently in Australia, a competition for I think they wanted a bunch of buildings, but we did one building. And we were flying around Google Earth, which is always fun, right? I mean, it's like you shoot in and you fly back into the solar system and you zoom in, and it's quite amazing. But we flew into the park next to the building site, and I just loved this. I loved that Google now that they've conquered the realm of human buildings, which were mostly 99% extrusions on the right, and those are actually three-dimensional, at least in a lot of cities, not all, but a lot. Google has now conquered that in its virtual world, but it's starting to try to do trees, and it does it by doing French topiary, which I love. So these are crystals. Like a tree becomes a crystal, and I like this image very much. I think about it a lot because it really shows that nature, in fact, is a construct. I don't believe for a second these trees are natural, that this park is natural. Even the word natural is very much complicated. It's a complicated word. I have nothing against plants, animals. I love all of those things. But the human idea of nature, I find concerning for architecture because it's used, I think, in a very dogmatic way and in a way, almost a mythical way sometimes, where we think that things are more than they actually are. And so I like that these trees are just objects sitting in a artificial landscape. So, what is a ground object? You'll be familiar, of course, when I spoke a second ago about the idea of a tube building or a conduit building. A lot of tube or conduit buildings will have friends who are landscape buildings at the top, number one. So that would be working on a building where you confuse the idea of landscape and architecture, and you think that they're the same thing. This is a big thing that was going on in the late 90s. Continues still to this day. Where you basically squish architecture into the ground, and you begin to sort of erode away its objecthood. That came out of a lot of theory from the 90s, of course. Relation of subject and object, flows, the plateau from Deleuze, all of these, body without organs, a lot of things that were going on in the 90s came out of that. So that gets an X. No, not working on that. So no lumps, get to nest. Number two, possibility for the bird in the nest. The bird in the nest is basically saying, okay, first of all, I'm going to have discreteness. The building object is going to become discrete from the ground. And not only that, it's going to have a kind of intermediary building, which we can call the ground building. It's a kind of deferral of the landing of the building on the earth. So separating the building from the earth. Gaps are very important there, and even like, let's say, a folding up or a kind of peeling away of the ground, just to cartoon it. It's very important. Gets a check mark. One way we can go with the ground. And of course, squished into a hole is a classic one, which I'll show you a couple examples of, where it's not really clear where the foundation is. It's certainly not the ground plane, and the building is certainly not extruded from zero. But the minute you squish a building into the ground, a couple of things happen. First of all, of course, you don't really know where the foot of the building is. But second of all, you enter the building at mid-level, which I think is pretty exciting, because you suddenly go from one world, which is understood as a three-dimensional experience, into another world, which is also a three-dimensional experience, rather than just saying human beings move around on a flat plane and buildings extrude out of that plane. Okay? So troughs here are very important, meaning the gaps that kind of run around those buildings when you squish them into the ground. So it doesn't fuse. And neither 2 nor 3 is anything allowed to fuse with things. So there's your bird in a nest. The bird is deferred to the earth by the nest. In this case, deferred again by the branch. We don't even see the ground in that, so I like that very much. That's a great model for the ground. Or the saucer in the teacup is a nice one because it folds up on the edges. The saucer, of course, never tries to fuse with the ground. It's always something you can grab. And, Brancusi, of course, is the master of the indeterminate ground. His entire body of work, I would say, is focused on trying to question what is a sculpture, what is a pedestal, where does one start and the other begin, where's ground, and so you have things on top of things on top of things on top of things into infinity, which is pretty exciting, I think. So buildings, we know these. The Whitney in New York is a classic figure squished into a hole. First of all, very important that it has a very strong silhouette, but more importantly, I really think is the way that it's literally, if you've been there, you know this, the architect, Breuer, has found a way to make it feel like it's squished into the ground. It's really only got a hole in the front of it, but it's just enough to make you feel that it's squished into the ground. And of course, you get to enter, not quite at mid-level, but higher than at zero by going across a bridge, and that sort of signifies it actually effects your transition from one world into another, which I think is fabulous. And then on the right, the Ledoux, which is a conceptual project up in Etching in the 1700s. But I love this one because not only does he turn a villa into a sphere that's basically standing on one molecule, which for the time was just wacky. And but then he puts it in a huge hole, and then he has flying bridges entering at mid-level, and even then he draws the landscape in a very quaint way here with grazing goats and all of this out here, as if to show that this thing really is not part of that world that I know. So I think that's a great model. And of course, Mies, Farnsworth House, everyone's familiar with. Really important project for a lot of reasons, but it's one strategy of this deferral that I'm talking about, where buildings can kind of come with their own ground. So you don't assume building is building, ground is ground, but buildings come with their own grounds. Now, I'm not talking about the modernist dogma that comes with that. Is a lot of times we need to lift buildings up on pilotis so that the gardens, these amazing gardens of the city, can go underneath the building and given back to the public space, which of course is an idea that failed miserably in the 60s, 70s, and all the post-war stuff that was built. And I also like this in particular this picture because if you notice, of course, when you put the building up on pilotis, there's only dead grass underneath it. So. Oh, did I miss my second strategy? Oh, okay. So nestling was the first one. Buildings that come with their own grounds, the second one. And so, if you've never seen one of these, I'm a super big fan of the Russian Ekranoplan, which is a ground effect vehicle. These things were built in like 88, 89, and sadly, they only 2 prototypes were built. They found out that, in fact, our idea that progress is to fly planes at 35,000 feet across the ocean, that makes a lot of sense. We all just assume it makes sense. that is you can save a third of the fuel flying across oceans by flying literally 3 feet off the water, because you're getting extra lift by flying right on the ground. So as things go, like Betamax and VHS, we picked the wrong one, and we went forward with 35,000 feet. These things died. Why? Because of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and 90. But very interesting for me as thinking about ground, because it's autonomous from the ground, but it's creating this ground effect. It's literally called a ground effect vehicle. It's creating an effect in the ground, but it's not fusing with it. So it's a kind of semi-autonomous relationship with the ground. So, objects wrapped in objects, or figures in a sack. So back to this idea of the sack and the supercomponents. I want to be more specific now. A few things about that I find very interesting. The first thing is I already talked to you about a little bit, but that maybe more precisely that one feature of an object wrapped in an object would be the readability of the outer silhouette of the outer object, and also to some degree the readability of the inner silhouettes of the inner object. So simultaneity of that. I knew kind of plasticity of object relations through squishing and nestling without fusion. So the guy on the right there, this is from artist Bar Hetz, who's a really interesting guy who invented a bunch of strange polymers, and he wraps human figures in them. And so, of course, very interesting how when sometimes it's tight fit on the figure and sometimes it's loose fit, creates different kinds of strange readabilities and mysteries about where the figure is, where's the sack. And of course, the deferred interiority, when you have those tight and loose fit effects, where you start to question, when am I actually inside? Is it in the sack, or is it inside the sack, inside the figure? Those kinds of things, which all have to do with this. The Russian dolls, of course, captures that idea of deferral of interiority, but because they're all the same form or isomorphic, I don't think that's as good of an example as the other one. But it is a kind of strange thing and a thing and a thing into infinity. So here's that effect of beginning to feel like there's something in there and getting a glimpse of it, but not really knowing the entire extent of what's inside versus what's being expressed on the outside. So these strange creases and points sticking out and things like that. Okay. Now, one thing about that, when you start to imagine a thing in a thing, you have to look back. You don't have to. You can look back and look at architectural history, recent history, in particular the late 80s and the early 90s, where Jeff Kipnis wrote about the sectional object in 93 in Towards a New Architecture, and that was very important as a kind of line in the sand against the idea of the free plan and the free section from modernism. Beginning to imagine that there are to use his language, sort of that there could be a box in a box. That was one of the models that he discussed. And one of the important things about that is the interstitial space that you get between the box and the enclosing box. So a couple of really important projects for that, of course, are the Jean Nouvel Tokyo Opera on the far left, which he did with Philippe Stark, and in this case, sort of like almost like teeth jammed into the interior, a kind of thick poche on the lower end and upper end to create a vast space in the interior. The UFA Cinema Center, which I was lucky enough to work on with Wolf Prix, and I'd call that an aquarium model of a figure in a sack. So you have several figures which are not really relating in a plastic way to the enclosure. It's almost like there's an independence of the shape of the enclosure and the shape of the figures, but there are things inside of something else, and in this case, they're in a completely transparent shell. On the other hand, on the other side, a version of figure in the sack, which is, I think, recently I've begun to think about it as a kind of almost a separate model. So a figure in a sack is one model, implied outer shell is another model. That's something that has an outer enclosure, but it's incomplete. Okay, so it's implied that thing is complete, but it's not complete. So there may be holes in it, there may be openings, it may not even be a full sack, it may be a surface. So one of the people who did that in a lot of projects was Le Corbusier, and the one that I like the most is the Heidi Weber Museum, which is also known as Centre Le Corbusier. It was his last project that he did. It actually wasn't completed until 2 years after his death. But I don't even know if you can see that. It's so small, but it's an amazing play on an enclosing object, which seems to, it creates the silhouette of the building, and it seems to be the enclosure, but it's actually quite open in there. And there's another building inside of that building. And on the right, Bernard Tschumy's La Frenois project, which you're familiar with, I'm sure, which is it's a folded roof, but it basically begins to enclose a whole area of the city. And in that case, like the UFA cinema, it also has a bunch of express circulation inside of the space, which I'll get to in a second. So one specific thing I want to say about these two projects, again, the Jean Nouvel on the top and the Le Corbusier on the bottom, is that when you're a practitioner and an academic with me, you want to get into the nitty gritty and you want to look at the source material. So these are drawings from the architects, and one of the things that I think is really interesting about the Jean Nouvel is, while on the one hand you see here it seems to be the gold or brass objects, which are it's supposed to be like instruments inside of an instrument case. They seem to be just sort of jammed in there. In the drawing, and this is from his office from the competition, there seems to be another what I would call an interior liner inside of it. So there's actually another line running all around that is actually continuous with the outer shell and beginning to fuse almost all of it together. So strange, because I've never seen that anywhere else. Interesting. And then Le Corbusier also, depending on what drawing you see, sometimes there will almost appear to be a sub-enclosure here, a glass or something, so you begin to believe that this pop-up here is part of the building, when in fact it's outdoor space for much of it. So, but it implies the possibility of a sub-enclosure, just as the Jean Nouvel implies the possibility of an inner surface, a liner surface. So back to the model. So we have on the upper left mysterious fall-off conditions of things which begin to present themselves in the outer silhouette of an object. You have the aquarium model, where you can simultaneously read through transparency the figure in an outer figure. You have the down in the lower left the idea of a liner, which would be something that's squished in between inner figures and the outer sac. And then on the right is a liner when you've removed the figures, removed the sac, and that's what's left is a kind of implication of a figure inside of a sac. In fact, it's just a single surface. So there's the idea of the infinite deferral through and the different kinds of space that you get when you work with the figure in the sac. Very importantly here is the liner. I'm drawing the liner in the inside. So you have the sac, you have the figures, and then you have the liner. And the liner not only is loose and tight depending on where it is, but it may go inside or outside of objects depending on how you weave it through there. So you create a whole layer of space here from category 1 to category 2 to 3 to 4 to the world. So you have a lot of opportunities there for breaking down the interior of a building, none of which have to do with thinking about subdivisions. The implied outer shell, a couple of examples from the office. Again, the idea of there being a sort of nested inner figure, partially visible, partially shrouded by an implied and incomplete outer shell. So there it is. A very old project I wanted to bring back and show you. This is the New York PS1 Young Architects competition from 2003, which is still going on to this day. So that was 10 years ago now. I wanted to just show it really quickly because the basic model for that project was in fact to have large structural cells which were read as mass inside of a loose outer skin. So let's say big diamond figures inside of a sac, so that at night, and the outer sac is sort of squished on from the top and the bottom, but then of course you get loose areas as well where there's sort of nothing being squished, which is just sac. So if we found out if you turn what is that called? Expanded aluminum different directions, you can get different effects. So on the interior objects, it's turned one direction, so it can capture the red light, and on the outside, it's turned the other direction, so it seems transparent. Now during the day, you read it as a mass, which is like a 9-foot thick roof, by the way, over a ground object, which is a separate kind of construction. It hovers on the ground, and then the thing hovers above. So it reads anyway as a sort of more of a monolith, and then there it is in that. So you get an object and a simultaneous reading. This is the Czech National Library, also a very old project at this point for me. 7 years maybe. Maybe I showed this last time I was here. I don't know. And just really quickly, this is the model that we made for it. This preceded the project, so we called it the buckyball at the time. We didn't really know what it was, but we made a bunch of buckyballs, and it was in response to the brief at that point, where they were asking us to do a national archive and a public library, and we were saying, well, that seems like a thing and a thing. So we made a bunch of models of how we could do a thing and a thing for that project, and it ended up being in section literally a levitated archive that was inaccessible from pretty much everywhere, except private entry, but visible from everywhere. So we could have the public library down below on the ground level. We could have special controlled reading rooms at the top, and then this floating archive in between. So and then the archive kind of squishes up into the roof and pushes the roof up to a height of 60 meters, even though, as the black arrow shows, the competition brief required us to stay at 15 meters. We went to 60, which got us to the second phase. But then the project proceeded to melt down and never get built. But we submitted this for the second phase. So there you go. There's the archive, the public library. Here you are looking down at the public library. You don't have direct access. And then looking out at the Prague Castle from the reading room at the top. So another older one. This is the Pop Music Center. It's not Taiwan. It's in Kaohsiung, actually, and it was a big international competition. I'm sure people in this room did it. And basically, this was the most sacky project probably we've ever done, where we literally stuffed a sack full of theaters. They asked for 9 theaters, and we decided we would go with a multi-layer sack, stuff it full of these objects and then begin to cut away at it. So again, we're getting at the same time this sort of indeterminacy and mystery of having shoved something inside of something else. It's sort of, these bulbous areas, and then in other areas, by cutting these sort of figural cuts out, you begin to get strange views of what's actually inside. So it's less like the isomorphism of the Russian dolls at the top, and more like a mutant onion, which has several centers. So when you cut through it, you get more or less visibility of those layers. Again, these models preceded that project. We made a bunch of things where we were squishing top and bottom on top of objects and then cutting away at it. So these, nice one. So these became the basis of the project. There's the strange cutting planes we used to cut away at it. And you see, if you cut at different depths and you use a complex cutting plane, you can begin to reveal that it is in fact multi-layer, a multi-layer shell. This one I'm just going to skip by. This is done for the Biennale. I'll just say this: if you put figures in a sack and you put a liner in a sack and then you remove the sack, one of the interesting things is that you get a gap between objects. So the object on the left and the object on the right are not connected. They're independent, but the object on the left, so you see the joint, right? The object on the left is also squishing into the liner. So those protrusions inside of the interior are actually the same object as it is out here. But they're not connected. So it's just like a sleeve. So there's the protrusion in the interior. And again, if you look at the overview of the thing, this is just a theoretical project for the Biennale, but you can see here, very, very importantly, this gap. Again, that's outdoor space. There's 2 separate objects that are wound together, in this case by having this joint, this complex joint, but also through tattoos, which I'll get to in a second. This is the Taichung City Center, which is a recent competition from this summer. The brief, with these things, you try to read the in between the lines in the brief and figure out what they want. And in this case, they said it was either one big building that was going to be divided into a library and a museum, or you could do 2 buildings and have a plaza in between. So whenever they say plaza, they actually want that. So we went with 2 buildings and a plaza in between. One other thing I'd like to mention is, I don't know if you can see this, that red line. We're right on the edge of a park. It's called Gateway Park. We're right on the edge of that park, and so there's not that much to relate to over there. But the city begins across the street at about a 30-meter height, and there's a huge convention center that's being built right now that's about 30-meter height. So we wanted to have 2 buildings so it could have daylight for reading rooms, and then we took the library and squished it in from the bottom. Why? So it could be a self-shaded building like you want for a museum. So here's the piece. There's that surface that's beginning to connect everything loosely together. We're also starting to break up the surface and give it thickness, so it's not just a surface of 1 millimeter thick, but it has a ton of poche in it that can be inhabited and used for other functions of the building, so it begins to mess up the diagram a little bit. We also lost a piece of this particular model, this interior chunk, which then we decided to leave it like that. We liked it better, so it's even looser of a relation. So here it is. You can see the surface is so thick that you can get inside of the roof. You can get a restaurant, which kind of a sky restaurant looking out at the park in the back, 6 meters thick. And the plan cut at the roof level, so you see all of this gray poche space, which is used for the restaurant and for other functions. And here's the negative space between let's call it a sack, even though it's an open sack. Between the sack and the inner figures, we drew the negative space to show where we could have an indeterminate interiority. So, meaning this would be if we didn't enclose it, which we did with glass, if we didn't enclose it, it would be outdoor space. So here's a picture of that space from the inside of the in-between space. So on your left is the figure and the gallery. On the right is the thick surface of the sack, and you're actually able to jump between the two, between this indeterminate space. And you notice we've also enclosed it with glass down below. So there's that thing. We didn't do it as glass infill like you might do if you were, I guess, a modernist, or if you just wanted to keep it simple. We decided also that the glass itself had to have an uneven relationship to both the figures and the sack, and so it began to have its own kind of shape, and it weaved around between the two objects. The tattoos on this project were related to sewing. We looked at complex joints and sewing patterns, and the way that the joint itself can create figuration. Rather than just saying a joint is just a beginning and an end of something, it's actually it can be figural as well. So we began to, in some places, highlight edges of supercomponents. Other areas deviate from that and even create some zigzagging and some other things that would basically create an alternate reading of the object, and also sort of, again, fuse it all together. Conveniently, in a lot of the projects that we do, when you have a thing in something else, you get a sort of atmospheric, not just an aesthetic world in a world, but you get an atmospheric world in a world, which may be called, let's say, if you were a building sciences expert, a microclimate or a buffer zone. So here's some of the pieces of construction here, and I'm really interested in chunkiness of stuff, breaking things down. So this isn't really a landscape, even though it's a thick surface, but it's a bunch of chunks coming together. Okay, so chapter 5, tattoos and the status of subdivisions. Again, I want to be clear that tattoo for me, as much as it sounds like a cheap word, when we talk about serious disciplinary terms, it sounds cheap. It's really not. It's actually really precise. And I tried to find alternatives for it for a while, and then I just gave up. I said, no, actually, that's the word. Why? Because a tattoo is something that's fully embedded in the skin. It's indelible, right? It's really difficult to get off. A lot of times, it even now involves in contemporary, and even ancient practice, it involves not just graphics, but also beginning to carve into the flesh, or even with subdermals, things like silicone implants inside of flesh. So there's a whole realm of stuff that can happen that has a lot to do with articulation of things without dealing with meshes or panels all over a thing all the time, but figuration on skin. Of course, you have some tattoos that are all over someone's body, yeah, of course, but I'd say that's the exception to the rule. For architecture, I think it's really exciting because, again, it gets us away from this discussion of panels, discussion of the material limits, or the lack implied thereby. And it also creates really strange scale effects. When you begin to tattoo buildings, it's not as clear anymore that the building comes from the earth, that it comes from these industrially limited pieces of material which we can identify with. It puts it in a more alien realm. So we did this before. So I love fish. I mean, these guys are crazy. The mandarin fish and the flowerhorn fish on the left. This guy's starting to feel like he wants a tattoo because his coloring is relating to the underlying structure in a few areas, right? Like you might expect it would do. And then across his body, it goes completely wild and has nothing to do with that. And of course, again, a biologist would argue that in terms of camouflage or whatever it is. And in terms of also the highlighting of the silhouette around the fish, and I'm sure that those are all true. And this is not me saying those things are not true. This is me saying, isn't it more than that? Isn't this more than the sum total of the science of that thing? Can't we look at this and be like, this is amazing, and how the eye runs across it, and how it actually creates a secondary reading of it? So we have the mass, but the tattoos are equivalent. Okay, they're as important as the mass itself. The guy on the right is even more hilarious. This is a genetically engineered fish. They're a big deal in China and Taiwan. This guy's engineered to have a big bulbous forehead. But more interesting to me is that, like, literally they've almost gotten it down to a science of being able to create Chinese characters across the fish. Of course, you can't read that yet, but I think that's amazing. High contrast figuration. A lot of stuff that we've been doing has been black and white lately because it's the most extreme way of creating that difference between the thing on the thing and the thing itself. Again, subdermals and tattoos and all that kind of stuff. And I can't talk about this. This will take me too long. But there is in fact a long history of people in architecture talking about tattoos, fighting about it. One particular fight had to do with whether or not they're autonomous on the human body. Keep these guys looking, Regal and Semper looking at people in the Maori tribes, which they just discovered. And then one guy saying that the spiral on the face shows that tattoos and that, in fact, human culture and the arts are always autonomous and independent from underlying structural or technological forms, whereas the other guy is saying, no, they are completely independent. And so, anyway, very interesting discussion. I'll do that next time. So a couple of precedents for the tattoos. While yes, I know the Frank Lloyd Wright textile block houses are, in fact, textile blocks. They are a kind of panelization. It's super interesting to me the way that they have deep relief in them, that there are different types of tiles. I went to a house with my students last fall from Yale where one of the 4 textile block houses, I think it was the Hollyhock in LA, and we found there were in fact 11 types of tiles. I had no idea. I thought there were maybe 3. Some of them even have openings in them, so I think that's a precursor, a kind of patchy surface. And also complete fade off of the tattoo into nothing in other areas. And then the CCTV from OMA, I've always been intrigued by that because it gives you an idea of how one could do tattoos in a mineral material logic, meaning with glass and metal, without having to do it in composites, which is what I'm promoting, where you can just through having a good hierarchy between seams, you can begin to create other kinds of mega figuration on a building. So now, part of this argument for the tattoos is, in fact, that it relates to the use of polymers and composite materials in architecture, and that when you begin to think about that, when you begin to think about the problematics of the Corvette body or the surfboard, you start to think about architecture and the scale difference and the need for articulation of those surfaces. You don't get anything for free with composites. You don't get seams for free. You don't get a lot of stuff that you get in bricks and metal panels and masonry and all of that stuff that we're used to getting for free. So you have to actually dream it up. So I've been working on what I call, other than tattoos, also metaseams, which is a type of tattoo. Metaseam, it's literally what it is. It's beyond a seam. It's not expressing material limits of what a factory can make. It's an aesthetic. It's an aesthetic approach, which may have to do with construction or it may not. And this would require a whole new lexicon of talking about architectural construction that might have to do, again, with squishing or sedimenting or inlaying or overmolding things inside of other things, which I think is really exciting. Model for that, Korean seafood pancake. I've done a bunch of skins and things over the years. Many of these are quite old at this point. A lot of them, well, let's say the ones at the top are quite old, but they were I call them the proto tattoo projects, where we were just starting to figure out that there could be a mismatch between some of the issues of performance that we were dealing with and the graphics that were on top of that. And then on the lower right are some projects that we did recently in the robot lab at SciArc, which have to do with sedimenting, squishing, inlaying structural core into multi-layer composite layups. So we're beginning to build some of these skins with the robots. A recent one in the office, we discovered that if you start thinking about metaseams as a new way of actually constructing and not just as something ornamental, you actually end up going back to Japanese joinery, which is really interesting, where they're dealing with, first of all, removing nails from construction. That was a kind of theoretical approach to a lot of this Japanese woodwork. No nails, so no mineral materials, which is something I've been saying for a while, and I just discovered it last summer. And also friction fit through weird dovetailing and inserts and those kinds of things, and I think that's very, very related to composite construction. So here's some pieces that we made where we began to squish and tuck and snap together different kinds of pieces, mega pieces of componentry that I think are one way of doing architecture in the post-panel way of thinking. So bye to this. I'm doing one last project, and that's it. Sorry, guys. That's good. Yeah, that too. Okay. From current slide. Okay, so this is a competition from Moscow recently for the National Center for Contemporary Art. I believe it's still running in the second phase. I'm not really sure. It's in a park in one of the outer rings of Moscow, and quite a strange site. It's pushed right up against a shopping mall. And one of the reasons we're not in the second round is we fought against this site. It was supposed to retain all of these roadways, which of course Khrushchev and Stalin and all those guys used to run their tanks all around and show support. And so we were supposed to keep this road here, and it was going straight through, so our building was pushed up against a shopping mall. We just thought that was sort of unethical, maybe just a bad idea. So we pulled the road down so we'd have some room for culture here, and we wouldn't be come the back shed to the shopping mall. So here's the figure in the sack I started to show before. Now you can see here that well, maybe I go to the diagrams first. So this one we wanted to do a mutant sack where we deal with kind of bring together a lot of the ideas we've been doing in other projects. And on the far left, you see the figures pushing out. So you have figures in the sack with a liner. And then we said, well, what if it was mutant? And we had we removed the sack and we started to think about it just as figures pushing into the liner, which becomes the sack. And then we said, well, what's more interesting is the hybrid model, where some of the figures are squishing in from the outside, other ones are squishing out from the inside, and some of them are literally breaking through the sack. So they become visible. So those are the three different models of figures that we were using for this project. You can see them kind of pulled apart here. And it's sectionally really important that, in fact, one of the figures, we call it the missing figure, right here, is actually not there. So there's something that's implied in the outer sack, which mysteriously is, in fact, not containing an object, but becomes usable areas for temporary galleries. This is a liner, which is loose fit, and becomes the entry lobby for the museum, but because it's loose fit, you can use the spaces here, below it, and above it for galleries as well. And then here's a moment where you actually have the figure still intact and still inside of the sack, being cut open, and that's an independent part of the museum. So there you see the diagram again with the layers of space. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The black are inside of actual figures, which have programs like theaters and multimedia rooms, things like that. The dark gray is the gallery space, and then the light gray is the public space. So the circulation, to come back to that a little bit, because I mentioned it earlier, the circulation is invisible. It's squished between the inner liner and the outer sack. So there's a space in there where you can move around, but it's not expressed either on the exterior of the building or the interior. It's relegated to sort of the machine paradigm, and it's sort of put away in between those skins, so that you always have a kind of strange alien read of the project as scaleless and all about objects and not infrastructures. So here's the entry. You might notice here a ground object appearing. The ground object is importantly sitting in a trough itself. For a little comedy and clarity, we began to even peel up the edges of it to make it deadly clear that we're not attaching to the land with the ground object. But also we go up and try to enter the project at mid-level by peeling off of the ground, and also there's a hole underneath the building. And here you see what I mentioned before, the delamination between the liner and the outer sac. Of course, we're cutting open the sac as well, so you can see inside, and it's inviting the public building. But you're also immediately seeing that in between space between the liner and the sac. And here again, the peeling of the ground, very important. And then also I call it the running leap entry strategy, which is basically, we don't know how to really get you over that area, but let's say there's about a meter where the building literally doesn't touch the ground, so you have to take the running leap to get in there. And again, the computer mesh is a big confusion in architecture. It's been reified by many as if the computer mesh, doing its calculus, knows anything about the construction industry, which it does not. So we're not working with that, but rather with a bunch of tattoo studies that we did. We did some more based on sort of dots, lines, hybrids of the two, which turned out to be the one we used. And we used the tattoo specifically to begin to blur the boundary between, or not blur the boundary, but blur the identity of objects. So these guys are literally separate. These figures are separate from the sac, squished in from the outside, but because they bleed onto the sac with black and patterning, it begins to confuse it. In the front, we start to turn this figure black, even though he's actually squishing out from the inside. So you begin to identify that there may be a figure in there or may not. We don't know. It's indeterminate. And finally, to the construction of it, we're proposing that it's made of chunks rather than sticks and panels. So what happens when you begin to chunk a building apart into pieces which are no longer just tiny pieces, but much larger pieces that can begin to have Japanese joinery conditions? And again, the tattoo is clicking in on the left, a separate object. So here we have a joint that we designed where it's all glue. There's no hardware. And it's all glue and friction. So you get X, Y, and Z lock on the thing, and all you have to do is glue a Band-Aid on the back and place it. And one of the nice things about being able to do really big pieces is, of course, and when you're doing composites, is that you can, of course, assemble out of truckable pieces. So these pieces here are brought to site in a truck, laid out next to one another, glued together with invisible joints into these super components, which do have these visible zigzag joints in addition to the tattoos to begin to articulate the project. So there you have it. Thank you very much.
Do you want us to ask a question? Students are already moved to another place, so we can have a couple of questions if there are any.
Thank you for the lecture, by the way. Recently, Professor Strauss-Jones kind of talked about the inevitable flatness of floors and how that should deal with kind of the ongoing in relation to a television museum. And I was wondering how you deal within the SAC model with the inevitable flatness of floors and kind of the subdivision that's implicit in that in that flatness.
Well, first of all, you notice I go to great lengths to mask floors.
Yeah.
So that's my first answer, but I actually want to show you an image of a project that I didn't get to show, where we're beginning to allow a little bit of that to appear in a housing project. And I'll just show you one image just as a kind of teaser. If I can even find it. Maybe I can't. Imagine that you're doing a housing project and you're starting to create strange crystal figures combined with ziggurat figures, and you're starting to puncture the sac as well as squish into the sac, and you're starting to get even more mutant. So this is us doing exactly what you're saying, beginning to find out if there can be a less idealized version of complete disappearance of the floor plate, and an allowance of it sometimes. But it's a very difficult problem, I have to say. And I don't really know. I mean, I've read that from Scott, and I know what he's saying, but and it is a fact of architecture, absolutely. That's why a lot of people like ground plans more than they like sections. So the ground plan is more like a painting, whereas the section always shows the ruthlessness or relentlessness or inevitability of the floor plate. So anyway, this is us trying to begin to let that kind of peek out at some point. It's a good question though in the sectional object discussion. Yeah.
I'm reading a very interesting paper right now where social error is critiques Richard Lab by Louis Kahn, and he says that there's a huge separation between what an architect envisions and its use, and he critiques the building a lot because there's very little consideration of its use when it's being done. I know that your proposed designs are very towards the form and a little bit less in social use. Is there
social use?
I'm questioning that.
Yeah. Do you mean function or social? How come you're switching terms? You said function
I'm
first.
talking about both.
Okay.
Do you have a consideration when you are doing form making towards the use of the building and its social transition, and if you do have them, what are they?
Them?
Them.
An approach, you mean?
Yeah.
A theory.
As you are creating all of these ideas,
Okay.
let's talk about.
I wanted to make clear, and I know I rushed through it, but when I showed you those models, I wanted to make very clear that yes, I am a formalist. There's no question about it, and I'm totally fine with that. I believe that good architects are formalists. I just believe that. I'll just tell you right now. I mean, so I want to be part of the good architects. Someday. I believe that, but I also showed you those models, and it is important to me that this is not just a formalism. I think it's too little for architecture. It can easily make us irrelevant, and I don't want that to happen. So that's why I pointed out that those models that I use not only imply form but also organization. And so even the idea of something inside of something else implies organization. It can never just be a formal idea. Now, am I going to try to squish certain kinds of projects into a certain kind of model? Sometimes maybe where the typology isn't like a snap fit, isn't a home run, and it's a difficult fit. Yes, I'm going to do that. Almost every time we'll do that. We'll try to squish something in, and we'll try to break the typology. But at the same time, other things, I don't know. I think typology and function are entirely overrated, and I know about the discourse that you're talking about over time. Yeah, of course Louis Kahn talks about that, but I don't think Louis Kahn is ultimately interested in that. Look at Louis Kahn doing Dhaka. Where is that, in Bangladesh? I mean, come on. That is somebody interested in cosmology and in the universe and in the weird mystery of strange objects being very close to each other but just far enough apart that you can kind of read it as a whole. They're floating on water, and this thing is amazing. This is not a functionalist at work. So, I'm going to call him out right here.
The socialist is saying that he does not consider the use in the beginning.
Okay, good, fair enough. So at least I got that right. Listen, again, if I have to look to my heroes, and I look at like Le Corbusier as well. You have somebody who's interested in the unité, for instance, interested definitely in the organization and in housing, but on the other hand, doing other things that have like Firmenich and Ronchamp and a bunch of his other masterpiece works that really don't have that much to do with function. It's not interested in expressing function. It's interested in architecture, and I personally believe that those things are really different. Those are different issues. I don't know how else to answer it. think that you cannot help but be understood socially and culturally. That will happen regardless. You can't control it. But I think that I guess I'm suspicious of architects who try to control the meaning that their building will ultimately have in that sphere. I'm just suspicious of that. I think more interesting to look at our own discipline and look at things that the way that architects have dealt with over time, have dealt with issues of materials, silhouette, plan, section, entry, processions, the window, the corner. There's a whole list of stuff that one could work on inside of architecture, which is really separate from those issues of function. And I think that doesn't mean you don't take care of function. Of course you do. You take care of it. Just like if you ask me about sustainability, if I were a diehard formalist, I'd say, not interested in that. To me, it's just state of the art. Like you do buildings, you make sustainable buildings now. But that doesn't mean that sustainable architecture is a logical term. To me, the idea of sustainable architecture is a contradiction. It's a contradiction in terms because the word sustainable does not in any way imply an architecture. So I can't stand it when I hear, and I know you didn't say it, but the idea that there is automatically an architecture associated with it. There might be someday. Maybe someone will come up with one. I have never seen it. I've never seen it. So until that day, let's not call it architecture. Let's just call it, good engineering or state-of-the-art engineering or state-of-the-art ways of making buildings. Just as if I were to do a theater or any other program, I would of course make a theater that works acoustically well, that has a good entry procession, that brings you from the world into the theater in a way that only architects can do. And it's just, to me, it's not even worthy almost of discussion of like function or no function. Of course it has to be functional if you're going to do buildings in the world, which is ultimately my goal. Now, if I were just an academic, I could say probably something else. But so I'm interested. I think you can do both. I don't think it's either or. But what you choose to talk about defines you as an architect. So, there's my answer. Anybody else? I'll take one more. Yeah. It's you.
Well, thanks for being here again.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed the entire lecture, especially kind of similarities that exist between you presented those first three ground diagrams between how the grounds can relate to the building and how that ties into the latter part of the lecture with the tattoo. You mentioned the idea of embedding things in kind of a surface of like something being on another surface and how they relate to one another, especially when something's under it. Like something else is essentially that relationship of architecture to the landscape. One thing that I'm a little bit kind of like, my mind's been reeling on it, kind of like thinking about it, is when you mentioned the tattoos as a type of objectification of ornament. Because when we think ornament, like it's been for ages that ornament is kind of perhaps taken in some senses it is superfluous. It's my subjective opinion based on what time I'm living in, the context I'm like surviving in. If that dictates the ornament, it's immediately subjective. In the same way that the tattoo on the last project, you mentioned in some cases it serves as this blend between the kind of like different layers, which immediately is subjective. So that's the one thing that I think is brilliant, but also like that you can console me on is the objectification of ornament.
Consult you on or console you on? Console, I like that. That was hilarious. I could also consult, but you're going to get a bill for that. So, let me see if I'm getting this. So you're saying ornament. I guess it's the subjective part that's got me a little bit confused what you mean, because I believe that it's all subjective. So I think that if you don't have subjectivity, you don't have any of the stuff that I'm doing anyway. I don't know how it could be fact. If I were Dutch and I was doing diagrams based on piling up programmatic boxes, even then, I would still say I'm being totally subjective and I'm not an objective person. Even if I had a huge bunch of data that I said made the perfect building, I still wouldn't believe it. Even if I said you could crowdsource a building and you could take a bunch of data from the internet and that would make the perfect building because it's the most democratic way to do it and everybody could put in their opinion and we're going to have the perfect building. That's an absurd idea. So anyway, so ornament, yeah, I think, I guess, the way I look at it is, ornament, graphics are kind of, I didn't really go through it, but you were reading, I noticed while I was talking, which is good. So, if graphics are sort of floating on top, it can almost be peeled off of architecture. That's not what I'm doing. And if ornament is sort of hanging off of a building, like a ring or like an earring is hanging off the building, I guess I just don't. I think it feels external to the architectural object. I want it to be so fully embedded that you can't even determine where it's ornament and where it's not. And that's why the word ornament, I have a problem with it, because it's been so overused in the last 10 years. Everyone talking about surface all the time. And I think that era is pretty much over at this point, but everyone's been talking about that and overusing this word ornament, that it becomes meaningless. It's jargon, which is one reason why even that term at the very beginning of my lecture too. I think I'm trying to also rehabilitate the word emergence a little bit too, because it's been completely jargonified and taken over by scientific practitioners in London and in other parts of continental Europe and New York City, and made into sounding like it's a bunch of architects doing scientific research in a laboratory, which is absurd. Emergence is way more than that. It's a really important thing, a way of understanding how new things get made, how you get out of hydrogen and oxygen atoms, how you get water, and still retain the hydrogen and oxygen as identities. So I mean, that kind of stuff is amazing. But I guess that's just me reeling a little bit against the term, not against you at all. It's more like I have a problem with it as well, because it's so overused, and it does sound sometimes like you could do ornament, and it's, as you say, it's supplemental to the architecture. It's unneeded, and you don't want to get in that discussion, I think, with a client, let's say, either. To me, that's why the tattoos have to do work. I have to know why they're on there. They're not just sort of putting a texture map on a building. Like, they are right where they are because they need to be there, because they're doing work. And a lot of times it'll be visual work, but they may also do other kinds of work. They may organize apertures on a piece of skin or something like that. They may do other stuff. They may become structural, But I don't like to load it up with all of that stuff right at the beginning, because it just, it's like it's a dead end. So that's where I think the tattoo, at least for me, at least just opens up a field of thinking, of being able, of some freedom of being able to think about something in a new way. So all right. Again, thank you guys very much. Thanks, Axel.